Thank you, Steve, for that very kind introduction. Some of it may actually even be true. Let's see. So, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and the great seven wonders of the ancient world. We have a list here of them. This is the traditional list of the seven wonders of the ancient world. You've already heard from Dr. Silverman about the Great Pyramid at Giza. Today you'll hear about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And during the remainder of the series, you'll hear about three others. Two will admittedly be skipped. But are these the great wonders of the ancient world? No, they're the great wonders of the Hellenistic world. This list was clearly composed in the Hellenistic period, probably in the 3rd century BCE. The latest one of these, the one that was the most recent to us, is the Pharos at Alexandria, built sometime 300 to 60 BCE, or Dr. Wegner will give a closer date, I'm sure, when you hear from her in March. It's interesting that the earliest and the latest are both from ancient Egypt. We have one from Greece, one from the islands of Greece, two from Turkey, two from Egypt, and one way, way off here in the east at Babylon, the one that I will be talking about today. We have, in effect, a lighthouse, two tombs, one temple, two statues, and one garden structure, shall we say. Now, where does this list come from? There are certainly various listings of great wonders of the ancient world, and the number 7 is quite often mentioned. In these, 7 was sort of a popular or mystic number. And the earliest sort of list, or what we take to be the list, comes from a Greek writer from Sidon in Lebanon who wrote sometime in the 2nd century BCE. He states, "I have gazed on the walls of impregnable Babylon, along which chariots may race, and on the Zeus by the banks of the Alpheus River. I have seen the Hanging Gardens and the Colossus of Helios, the great man-made mountains of the lofty pyramids, and the gigantic tomb of Mausoleus. But when I saw the sacred house of Artemis, that towers to the clouds, the others were placed in the shade. For the sun himself has never looked upon its equal outside Olympus." The sacred house of Olympus, of course, being the temple of Artemis, or Greek Diana, at Ephesus. One notices who is skipped from this, the lighthouse of Alexandria. And what do we have in addition to make up 7? The walls of Babylon. The walls of Babylon appear in numerous places, and in fact, in the classical writers, Hellenistic writers, and cuneiform sources, what was a marvel at Babylon were the walls of that city. Herodotus tells us in his great history, Herodotus, the great historian of the 5th century BCE, describes Babylon and in great detail describes the walls of the city. It is surrounded by a deep moat full of water, and within the moat there is a wall 50 cubits wide and 200 high. The royal cubit is 2 inches longer than the ordinary cubit. On the top of the wall, they constructed along each edge a row of one-room buildings facing inward with enough space between for a four-horse chariot to turn. There are 100 gates in the circuit of the wall, all of bronze. The great wall that I have described is, so to speak, the breastplate or chief defense of the city, but there is a second one within it, not so thick, but hardly less strong. So we have actually many, many descriptions of the walls of Babylon. Now, how do we know about Babylon? Well, the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey excavated the site from 1899 to 1917, so for about 20 years. In fact, he basically lived on the site. He had a vast team of workers there helping him in the excavations of the city. In fact, he even built a railroad to help remove the dirt from the site. So he revealed a large part of the city and published these. In fact, he has a whole book on the city walls of Babylon, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Now, last year I was on sabbatical in England, and one day I got an email from the people arranging this lecture series telling me that I had been volunteered to give this lecture by my dear colleague in the next office. Now, if he had suggested the Great Walls of Babylon, fine. There's a lot about them from cuneiform sources. There's a lot about them from classical sources. They've been excavated. I could have shown a large number of, I hate to say rather boring photos, but I could have shown you where the walls were, the length of them, and so on. And I could have talked about the history about it, how the city of Babylon was destroyed by the Assyrian ruler Sennacherib in 689, razed to the ground so that no one would ever find the site again, how it was rebuilt by Sennacherib's son 11 years later, and then under the Neo-Babylonian kings, it became a great wonder of the world. I could have talked about the sieges of Babylon, in which the Babylonians held off the Assyrians from the city, sieges in which people starved to death, stories about the people in Babylon eating leather because the food had run out, about selling their children into slavery to get food so that they could eat, or about how stories of a mother would not open the door to her daughter because they were all starving. So I could have done a really great thing about that. Unfortunately, I got volunteered to do the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And the problem with this, of course, is we don't know where the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were. We don't know what they look like. Maybe we found them and we don't recognize we've found them. Were they a figment of the classical writer's imagination? We do not have any description of gardens at Babylon from the cuneiform sources, the area of which I'm a specialist. All the information on them comes from classical sources, Greek and Roman writers. Now, I'm a cuneiformist. I work in the Akkadian language, so this causes a little bit of a problem for me. So we'll see what happens in this lecture today. Now, Koldewey did a fabulous job of excavating at Babylon. We can see the great walls of the city, the area that was enclosed within the outer wall and the inner wall was something like 3 3/4 square miles. It was probably the largest city in the ancient world. We have excavations of various palaces throughout it, great ziggurats or staged temple towers, numerous temples around the city, gateways, processional roads, and of course, as I said, the walls and gates and moats and so on. So we actually do have a lot that has been found. Now, what do we think the city may have looked like in antiquity? And we're going to take a few minutes and watch a video clip from the courtesy of the Royal Ontario Museum doing a flyover of what Babylon may have looked like in the ancient time. Here we see the reconstruction of it. We're going through the processional way, entering the Ishtar Gateway, the main processional entry to the city. A replication of this is found in the museum in Berlin, with its glazed brick panels on either side. Going down along the side of the southern palace, we're going to turn inside. Okay, some bits are a little cheesy, but the glazed brick facade of the entry from the main courtyard into the throne room with the Lion of Babylon. Looking down over the palace as we leave to their hanging gardens of Babylon. Apparently the person who did this didn't want to do it, but he was forced into putting a hanging gardens in by the Royal Ontario Museum, or so I understand. Lovely nice pool on the top. Not that we want one on a day like today. Okay, heading outside down the great processional way. We're going to go into the enclosure of the Tower of Babel, the Ziggurat of Babylon. Sort of a equivalent of it looks like a multi-tier wedding cake, as I always describe it in classes, of 7 tiers with a small temple on the top, glazed in blue, looking out over the city. Seeing the major temple of Marduk down there, the Euphrates River, which runs through the center of the city. Now we're on the west bank of the river, looking across through a bridge. The Temple of Marduk, and looking down again from up on high, from the Ziggurat, the Tower of Babel. So, that is what the people who organized this collection thought the city looked like. Now, we'll come back to some of that along the way. Now, as I said, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are not attested in any cuneiform source whatsoever. In fact, there are no real description of any gardens at Babylon in cuneiform sources. That's not really true. We have reference to orchards and so on within the city walls, but something special garden-wise for Babylon is not found in the cuneiform sources. So we're forced to rely on classical sources. And being a specialist in cuneiform in Egypt, I'm afraid I always think the classical sources, you got to read them a little bit with a little bit of doubt, a few grains of sand in taking them. So we have, sorry, my finger got too far ahead. Josephus, a Hellenistic Jew writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, describes the city of Babylon, making use of information from Berosus. Now, Berosus was a Babylonian, a priest of the main god of Babylon, Marduk, and he lived around about 300 BCE. He wrote a history of Babylon, the Babyloniaca, about 290 BC. And unfortunately, it's not preserved. We only have quotations from it in other classical writers. And here again, we hear about the city. We hear about the wall. He built a triple wall around the inner city and a triple wall around the outer city, etc. He talks about making it a brick, building a new palace. This is Nebuchadnezzar building this. And we do have a description of the Hanging Gardens. In this palace, he had high stone terraces built that give the appearance of being mountains planted with all kinds of trees. He had constructed and prepared what are called the Hanging Gardens for his wife, who had a love of the mountains since she had grown up in Media, which is really in Persia. Now, just note in passing, that the palace with which this garden is associated took 15 days to build only. Now just sort of keep that in mind, in your mind. Okay, the clicker is not going to work for us. Now, another description of it from Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century before the Common Era. There was also beside the Acropolis the Hanging Garden, as it is called, which was built not by Semiramis, but by a later Syrian king to please one of his concubines. For she, they say, being a Persian by race and longing for the meadows of her mountains, asked the king to imitate, through the artifice of a planted garden, the distinctive landscape of Persia. The park extended 4 plethora on a side, and since the approach to the garden sloped like a hillside, and the several parts of the structure rose from one another, tier on tier, the appearance of the whole resembled that of a theater. If you can think of a Greek theater, you think of a semicircle with very steep seating. Okay. Now, so we have some descriptions of it. There's several more, but I won't bother you with reading those. Now, Berosus, who was a Babylonian, assigned the Hanging Gardens to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, who was Nebuchadnezzar and when was he? Well, here we have sort of a time chart, and you can see that he's a long, long time ago, over 2.5 millennium ago. And I always just since I deal with the cuneiform documents, to indicate when did writing begin? A long, long time ago. So Nebuchadnezzar is further away from the beginning of writing and history in Mesopotamia than it is from today, basically. Now, who was Nebuchadnezzar again? Now, many of you may know about him. He appears in the Bible in numerous places, particularly in the book of Daniel, although admittedly there he's often confused with the last ruler of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, a man by the name of Nabonidus. He was the second in the line of rulers who gained their independence from Assyria. And he's left us a lot of documents, a vast, vast number of documents, written on clay cylinders, clay tablets, written on stone, written on bricks. We have a number of them in the museum, and in the Babylonian section we have a very lovely cylinder of his. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't describe anything about Babylon. It describes the building of a temple at a nearby city. It's interesting, however, that in some of his inscriptions, such as this one that's found in the British Museum, the East India House inscription, in describing the building of his palace, he states he did it in 15 days. Now, why do I emphasize that? Because Berosus had said the same thing. So this means that Berosus, who lived, as I say, 300 BC when he's writing, clearly had access to this type document and was using cuneiform sources. We know he could read cuneiform. That's not a problem. The last written cuneiform document was 76 AD, sorry, not 75. Used to be 75. Recently they found another one, 76 AD. So cuneiform was still being written. So clearly, he comes from Babylon. He was a priest of the temple there. He wrote a history of Babylonia. And he clearly has access to traditions, if not reading. So I must admit, I tend to give greater credence to a Babylonian about the Tower of Babylon, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, than I do to these foreign Greeks. Now, I do acknowledge that at the time of Berosus, Babylonia was ruled by Greeks. We're in the Hellenistic period. Alexander the Great has come through, conquered as far as the Indus. He's dead at this point. He died in Babylon. We'll come back to that. And Mesopotamia, Babylon, is ruled by one of his generals, or actually by a descendant of one of his generals at the time of Berosus. So actually the Babyloniaca was written in Greek and then was referenced in Greek by Josephus and various other classical writers. What did Nebuchadnezzar look like? The one responsible for, according to Berosus. Well, we have one image of him. This is the only one I know. I'm sorry, it's not very clear, but you see a man with sort of a pointy hat holding a staff or spear in one hand. And what you may not see is the Ziggurat of Babylon and an outline here. And actually the inscription on this document, which is off in Oslo in Norway, describes the building of the Ziggurat and other works at Babylon. You may wonder where the name Nebuchadnezzar comes from. Names mean things in most languages, and his name means, "O Nabu, protect my son." Nabu is the god of writing and the son of the patron deity of Babylon, Marduk. Nebuchadnezzar left us a lot of documents. He created the largest empire that Babylon ever held. Controlling from into southern Iran over here, all the way over to the border of Egypt there, going well up into Turkey. Carchemish is right on the border of Turkey and Syria. A very, very large empire, the largest empire that Babylonia had ever controlled. Now, we know mainly about Nebuchadnezzar from the Bible, where he's talked about in the book of Daniel, but in various ways. But we're particularly hear about him in his campaigns in 597 and 586, where he went and conquered Jerusalem, the kingdom of Judah, where he removed the king in 597, put a new one on, and then in 586 destroyed the city, destroyed the Temple of Solomon, and carried off the Judeans into captivity, the Babylonian captivity. So he goes down really rather negative, shall we say, press in the ancient world. This type thing of carrying people off in exile, typical thing in the ancient world. The Hittites did it back in the middle of the millennium earlier. The Assyrians before the Babylonians did it over 150 times to various different people. After you defeat them, to pacify them, you move them to another area, so they have to build new lives for themselves. They can't be worried about doing nasty things, rebelling, and because they have new neighbors, they're uncertain, so they're going to be quiet is the idea. So actually, the Babylonian captivity, and actually the lost 10 tribes of Israel earlier by the Assyrians, were very, very typical procedures in the ancient world to rule conquered people. We hear about the exile from the Book of Kings and also from the Book of Chronicles, how the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, came and took Jehoiakim of Judah, carried him off, and as well looted the temple of Solomon, and then on another occasion destroyed it. So he took them into captivity. We hear about this from the biblical account, which many of you are still quite aware of. But we actually have cuneiform sources which support this as well. The Babylonian Chronicle, which describes sort of a series of major events in various years of a long series of kings, mentions that actually, it only mentions the one, the very first one, I do acknowledge, in 598-97, how the king of Akkad, which is the term they use for Babylonia, marched to Hatu, which means the west, encamped against the city of Judah, captured it, seized its king, appointed a king of his own choice, which is exactly what it says in the Bible, and took vast tribute back to Babylon. So we actually do have cuneiform sources of this. And I thought you might be interested. Actually, the Judean king was not treated badly when he was taken off to Babylon. We actually have ration documents found in Babylon, and where they're found we'll come back to later, issuing lists of rations of oil generally, but of some other commodities to various hostages, captives there. We have references to the son of the king of Judah, references to people from Byblos and Arvad along the Mediterranean coast, Greeks, and also the son of the king of Judah. 5 sons of the king of Judah. So we actually have an reference to the king of Judah as well. So we know of the king of Judah being held captive there. Now you may well know that one of the great treasures of the Babylonian section of this museum is a group of documents from the Marashu collection, and in these documents, dated generally from the 5th century BCE, we have actually references from the site of Nippur, where Penn excavated back in the 1800s, to individuals with Hebraic names, as found here. So we have a lot of material in our collection dealing with in the Judean exiles in Babylonia. As a side sort of issue, I thought you might be interested. Most people have never heard about it, but actually a number of years ago, an archive of documents was found in Iraq, which actually come from the city of Judah. This is the city that the Judean exiles were located in Babylonia. We think it was near Nippur. So we have a whole treasure trove of documents from the Judean exiles with numerous Judean names, Hebraic names, and West Semitic names, where we find how they were quite well assimilated into Mesopotamian culture. Most of these are not, there's about 100 or more of them. Most of them are not yet published, but when they do get published, in fact, a book has just appeared in the last few days, scholars are going to be salivating over these documents. Now, Koldewey found a lot of the work done by Nebuchadnezzar at Babylon, by his father, Nabopolassar, by earlier kings, and by later kings as well. And we see that Babylon was a very, very impressive building in the Neo-Babylonian period. I mentioned we saw the overview of the processional way leading up to the Ishtar Gateway, and so I'm just showing you a few photos of the remains that were found by Koldewey. Oops, sorry. We can see the walls and towers lined with impressions of animals. This actually was below the ground level. Below the ground level, they were just in regular brick. Above the level, they were in glazed brick panels. This is what the model of what we think the entryway to the main processional entryway to the city looked like. And as I said, it's been restored, rebuilt in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. And if any of you go to Berlin, you really must see it. It's a very, very impressive structure, and they've got a number of very fabulous other things as well. And again, another reconstruction of it here, with images of lions and sort of dragons and bulls on it. The lion associated with the goddess Ishtar, the bull associated with the god Adad, and the dragon with the god of Babylon, Marduk. Here we see a lion. A number of these, this is how the Babylonians decorated their palaces. Up in Assyria, there was stone. We have stone wall reliefs. But down in Babylonia, there was very, very little stone. So for decoration, they did molded brick and then glazed and decorated them in various colors. This is what it looks like today, an aerial view, the Ishtar Gateway going down here, the southern palace here, northern palace up here, Saddam Hussein's palace there, an artificial mound. We have found by the Germans the great temple of Marduk, which is just what, and we saw a reconstruction of it there. Now, but why are we here today? The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Now, where were they? Well, I don't know. I'll tell you right up front. I haven't the foggiest notion where they were. There have been at least 7 proposals for locating them at Babylon. And we will look at them very, very briefly. We don't want to go into too great details about them. And also, what did they look like as well? Based upon the Greek descriptions of them, what may they have looked like? So this is what we're going to look at first. Now, as I said, there's really about 5 major classical writers describing the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Berosus is one of them, being quoted by Josephus and by other people. So if you sort of pull all the stuff together, and they're contradictory without any doubt in certain places, sort of what are the things are we told about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? Well, one says they're inner close to a palace, another besides an acropolis, on the summit of an acropolis or citadel, another one next to the Euphrates. Okay, maybe close to the palace, on a mound near the Euphrates, maybe. Who built them? Well, actually, only one document, Berosus says Nebuchadnezzar. One says not Semiramis, but a later Syrian king. Now, Semiramis was I don't like to say legendary great queen who conquered the world, but something along those lines in Greek history. We tend to think that she's sort of an amalgam of two Assyrian queens who were very important. Not that they ever ruled independently, but that they were very important. One called Samuramat, and so you can sort of get Semiramis, Samuramat, some of the consonants are the same, the vowels. Okay, this is a Semitic language, consonants are important, vowels can change around. That's being a bit loose, but it's sort of the idea. And another queen. But it's not this person, but a later Syrian king. Now, Syrian, what do they mean by that? From the Greek point of view, someone over that way, which could include Mesopotamia by Syria from their point of view. If you're off in Greece, it's off there. Particularly when Assyria and, of course, Syria are connected, so the area. One says it's the king of Assyria who reigned over Babylonia. Why was it built? For a wife, a concubine, a Persian wife, for her home, as a memory of the mountains from which she came from. Quite clearly, what all of them indicate along the lines is the idea of a mountain or terraces or a theater with sort of going up and up and up, sort of like a very steep theater with a seating down where you are. I mean, it's rather flat here, but I'm sure you've all been up in balconies in theaters where it's very, very steep going down, or have you seen a Greek theater? So they're all pretty good about that. A number of them emphasize the use of stone. Very, very little stone in Mesopotamia, particularly down in Babylonia. Particularly large blocks to actually do anything with. Problem. Size, well, difficult. One of them that we read said for plethora, which is about 30 meters, say 100 feet on a side. Top level, the height of the city wall, or about 25 meters, 75 feet, 80 feet along those lines. Supported by galleries, often with vaulted rooms, so vaults underneath to get it up, thick walls to support them, and a couple of them mention machinery for raising water to get them up on these terraces. One of them actually specifically mentions the use of the screw, Archimedes screw. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. We'll come back to that later. But this is sort of a number of the things that these inscriptions point out. But in particularly, appearance of a mountain, terraces, theater. We should keep those in mind. Okay. Where do people suggest it may have been? Back in the 1880s, approximately, a man by the name of Hormuz Drassam, who was involved with the British excavations in Iraq, he did some work at Babylon. This is before Koldewey, and he suggested that a mound, which is about 60 feet high, sort of on the northern part of the city, was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Now, this is the most prominent sort of mound in this area. Well, before Saddam Hussein built his palace on a mound. And remember, some of them suggest it was on an acropolis. It's close to the Euphrates River, as mentioned. The structure that was found in there by Koldewey seems to have been a monumental building of some type, a palace perhaps, or some people think a sort of a fort area for a defensive work. There's a very interesting set of 3 stone wells here, set close together and linked by an underground water channel. So he suggested, because of this, okay, maybe this was where the Hanging Gardens. It fits a certain number of things. But from the other documents, you sort of get the idea that it's in the main part of the city, not very far out. The fact there's 3 wells, okay, you're going to need wells in any palace to get water anyway, even if you are close to the river. So, possible suggestion. Generally has been totally abandoned by people ever since. Next suggestion, well, one that goes back to a man associated with Penn, Sir Leonard Woolley, who was involved with the excavations at Ur, as you all know. He excavated at Ur a ziggurat, or staged temple tower, and he had the idea that on the terraces of the one at Ur was mainly just 3 levels, but in the Neo-Babylonian period it had more. There were plantings, gardens, plants upon them. He found sort of little, I don't like to say holes on the platforms, which he thought were used for drainage, sort of weeper holes, so that you could have plants up there, water them, and then the water run out. Yeah, maybe. People who now work with these think that they weren't weeper holes for drainage, but they were to help dry the interior of mud brick, to sort of I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a historian philologist, so I don't want to get into that argument. The ziggurat at Babylon would have been the most prominent feature of the city. Mesopotamia is flat as a pancake. To have a structure that was about 300 feet high really would have stood out. And particularly if the top level is glazed, as we're told, in blue glazed bricks. In the sun, it would have been extremely, extremely impressive. Now, you look at the 7 wonders of the world. In large part, one of the main things about them is they're tall, they're big. The Great Pyramid, a lighthouse that's vastly tall. The statue of Helios at Rhodes, again, it's supposed to be a mammoth statue, whether the 2 legs were on different sides of the harbor with the boats going through the middle, as some people suggest, maybe, maybe not. But still, massive height as well. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus and also the Temple of Ephesus were major, major structures. And the statue of Zeus was known for monumentality as well, the one at Olympia. So, this is the most prominent thing. But there really is no evidence there were ever any plantings on the platforms. It's not that close to the river to bring water if there were plantings up there. And there really aren't wells for bringing water that way either. And certainly it's not associated with a palace. So, somewhat difficult. There's also no stone here as well. And some of the Greek inscriptions emphasize the use of stone. What does the Hanging Gardens, the Ziggurat at Babylon look like today? I thought you might want to know. This is what it looks like today. It's a hole in the ground. The Arabic name is the equivalent for the frying pan. If you think of a turned over frying pan, you get the idea. And this is it as well today. Why is it like this? Blame the Greeks. I'm a Near Eastern person. I'm going to blame the Greeks for everything bad. No offense. The ancient Greeks. Modern Greeks are fine. Alexander the Great came through, conquered Babylon, grandiose ideas, restore the ziggurat there. Don't just restore it, knock it down and rebuild. Knocked it down, he died early. This is one story about how it happened. There are others, one will say. Okay, here we have the ziggurat there. Now we're going to move on to the palace. Now, certainly the connection with the palace is found in some of the Greek sources for the Hanging Gardens. Here we have an aerial view of what the southern palace looked like. The northern palace up here is very, very badly eroded. The city wall ran through here, so the northern palace was sort of an annex, an addendum, a bulwark to the north of the main palace here. And off in one corner, close to the Ishtar Gateway, is a very strange structure. Oh, okay, here we just saw a reconstruction of what the palace looks like today. It was rebuilt in the time of Saddam Hussein for purposes of tourism. And off in this corner here, you see a very peculiar set of rooms. Oh, okay, the throne room again. Now, they're unlike anything else in the palace. And there seem to be a series of vaulted rooms in of an unusual location, and there's a lot of stone found there. There's also a set of wells found there as well. A well that had 3 different shafts, which Koldewey, who excavated this, thought that the 3 shafts were for a sort of a system of buckets on a chain going up and down and around to bring water up to the top to water the Hanging Gardens. You notice the walls are extra thick. We know one of the sources at least mentions the walls of the Hanging Garden being thick. And obviously, if you're going to have something high up, you need thick walls for the strength to support what is above them. So this was Koldewey's idea of what it was. There are problems with this. First of all, it's really near the entryway, the main entryway. So you're rather exposed there to everything going by, and it's near the main entry to the palace. In fact, to get to it, you have to go through here. Now, you would think if this was a garden for the king's wife, you'd want it further in, more private. So perhaps somewhere back in this way. Another problem with it is this is where the ration texts that gave food to the Judean king were found. Why on earth would they be in the garden? We now, a view of many scholars now is that actually this is a storehouse. We can't explain why the walls were particularly thick, but who knows? This is a reconstruction based upon what Koldewey thought the Hanging Gardens here would have looked like. So a structure with vaults underneath and terraces up above that would have had plantings on them. What next suggestion? Well, more recently, an English scholar, Donald Wiseman, suggested up here, just outside the palace, closer to the inner areas of the palace, between the river and the palace itself, an area up against the river, and basically you just have a sort of park with a series of terraces up against the side of it. And so you would have terraces, it'd be close to the palace. Okay, it's not on any acropolis, but not all the Greek sources say this. And how many of these Greek writers actually were in Babylon, actually to see what these Hanging Gardens supposedly were look like? Very, very few of them indeed. So they are probably reporting on what other people have told them, and stories, well, get exaggerated as they get passed from one person to another. That's another suggestion. More recently, A scholar, Julian Reid, in the British Museum, formerly of the British Museum in London, suggests this area. It's called the Western Outwork or Western Bulwark. It's right between the palace and the river, which is over here. There's an area with fabulously thick walls close to the inner areas of the palace that are here. And certainly there were remnants of some structures in it, but there was an area where there are no structures at all. And he has suggested that this may be where the hanging gardens were, on terraces. So really protected by a very thick wall from the river. I should have mentioned, there's no particularly thick wall here. If the river flooded, this area could get drowned, according to Wiseman's reconstruction. And we're not actually even sure that this area, which is outside of the walls, actually wasn't flooded by the river. This is Reid's reconstruction of what the hanging gardens may have looked like in this area. Again, a series of terraces protected by a great wall. Possible. It's not large, but actually the size of it fits approximately what the Greek sources would have said. Another suggestion is just outside the palace walls itself, where a man by the name of Stevenson, and we'll come back to him later, has suggested that there is a mound just outside the palace which has never been excavated, and he suggests a freestanding structure for the hanging gardens there, something along these lines. So sort of like a ziggurat in a way, but much lower levels, with tree plantings on them, with water being brought up by a series of water wheels to the top. These are the suggestions that have come. Now, we talk about gardens and hanging gardens, but a question then, of course, comes, how are you going to water them? Are you going to have people carrying up bucket after bucket after bucket to the top? The typical method in ancient Mesopotamia was buckets, using a shaduf, a bucket on the end of a pole, and you lift water up. Now, for the gardens, this would have been a mammoth problem. Stevenson says the use of water wheels. And here we have one from the Middle Euphrates. But we have no evidence that water wheels were tested in this time in Mesopotamia. He's assuming they were. We have no document to that fact. Another scholar has suggested using the Archimedes screw. And one of the Greek writers does say they used the screw to get water up. You see it here. It's a sort of a spiral. It pulls the water up to a cistern, and then you use another one to pull it up and up and up. And apparently it's quite efficient. But actually, we have no evidence of the screw being used in Mesopotamia. It was used in Greece, and it was used in Egypt. Mesopotamia, not. Although Dr. Daly, who's proponent of this view, would argue there is a reference to it in one cuneiform document. I'm less convinced by that, I must admit. She takes it, the idea based upon the outside of a palm tree, which seems to have spirals on it. And she takes the word for a palm tree to mean a screw, like an Archimedes screw. It's an interesting suggestion. So we have 7 places at Babylon. Is there another suggestion? Now, there has been. In a series of articles, an esteemed English colleague of mine, Stephanie Daly, has published a view that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were not at Babylon. They were at Nineveh in northern Iraq. We have no descriptions of gardens at Babylon, but at Sennacherib's palace, about 680, 690, we do have a description of gardens there, which were like a mountain. It's a short description. This is really about all. It's repeated on a number of occasions. And this is where she thinks the date palms were actually screws. Where was Nineveh and where at Nineveh? Well, Nineveh in the north of Iraq, where we know that there were aqueducts created at Jerwan. Where is Jerwan? To bring water to water the city. We have images from Assyrian inscriptions of gardens there, and including vaults, probably for carrying in an aqueduct. She suggests that close to the palace of Sennacherib, on the citadel there, here we have a reconstruction of it, in this area was this structure. So the Hanging Gardens at Nineveh. Well, it's an interesting idea. We have no references to gardens, anything in Babylon. We have them for Nineveh. Greek and Roman writers did confuse Assyria and Babylonia. Kings of Babylonia were called kings of Assyria. Kings of Assyria were called kings of Babylon. Sometimes Babylon and Nineveh were mixed up as well. Possible. It's an interesting suggestion, and some of you may have seen a PBS documentary in May supporting this view of hers. So, where were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? 7 possible suggestions at Babylon or Nineveh. What did they look like? Were they actually sort of structures in terraces, artificial? Were they more natural terraces? How were they watered? By water wheels or by the Archimedes screw? Well, that's the million-dollar question. Now, some of you may complain the million-dollar question. Shouldn't it be the $64,000 question? And I'm old enough to know that. But there is a reason for the million-dollar question. Stevenson's proposal that he made on the reconstruction was as a result of a competition. Back before the fall of Iraq, in the time of Saddam Hussein, he created a competition to rebuild the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And the prize was over $1 million. I don't remember how much it was, to whoever came up with the best idea for building them. I must admit, and I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know what is the correct idea. I don't know where they were. I don't know what they look like. All of these suggestions have good points for them. All of them have bad points for them in my mind. So I'm afraid I'm a scholar and I want to be honest. I guess all I can say is, searching for the Hanging Gardens, I've not found them. Thank you.